My name is Monk Rowe for the Phillies Jazz Archive, and I'm pleased to have a second session with Cecil McBee about 2 weeks after our first conversation. Thanks for finding time again. And you mentioned that you still live your bio clock is still you're still a nighttime person. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, when you're in Tokyo, which is 14 hours in advance of your clock for a couple of weeks, then you return to New York, supposedly back in reverse to what your rhythm would be about, and then you go to California, and then to
Hmm.
Texas. So over all these years, I managed to function around this time of the day, uh, Eastern time. I'm up about maybe 11:30.
Okay.
First thing I do is run to my bass and make sure that I'm okay. Really, I do. I do. I'll play
Is
a
that
couple.
right?
Yeah, that sets my standard for the day. I'll play a couple of notes because there's some excuse me, I'm working on now that I've had, uh, you know, favor to over the years. Things are opening up now on the instrument you know, uh, that I'm very excited about, soloistically.
Well, that I want to get back to that in a while because that sounds really uplifting. Wanted to make a few stops in your life that you had talked about 2 weeks ago. And first of all, a brief question about your upbringing in Oklahoma. You said that the social conditions there were difficult when you were a child, and I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, um, uh, I was raised by my single parent mother, and there were three brothers and two sisters. Right, I was number three in the rotation, if you will, and uh, I truly, given recent news about Tulsa, Oklahoma, uh, about conditions that took place during the race riot. Okay. Uh, my mother had all these years had uh, related to us that at 8 years of age, she had to drop out of school because of the loss of both parents in the same year. Uh, this was in southern Texas. And so she and her three sisters, elder sisters, she was the youngest of 13 kids.
Oh,
They moved to Tulsa, right? And my mother, Alice, was the only one that had children, which was, of course, us. And she, uh, God, I hate to say this. It's very uncomfortable to say this, but I never looked at my father in his eyes and said, hello, or who are you, or what is this about? Uh, he was nowhere to be found, given my time. I think my older brothers, they knew him. They never talked about it. She never talked about it. And so she, when I would ask her about her parents, uh, she said, as I mentioned before, they passed away, the same year. And that was it. You never really entered that conversation again. But now, over recent information about these Tulsa riots, you know, I think, quite frankly, she just didn't want to disturb us because I think I lost my grandparents in that riot. And my mom, in having moved to Tulsa when she was 8 years age, so she said, she could not read nor write till the day she died. So any information that she would impart to me about anything was rather limited. See, so point is, we as kids, we had to make out on our own with being young men. Your first thought was to help her, to make sure the burden was off her, and so forth. Survival was concerned. You know, it was always little food, et cetera, et cetera. So I think my music began when, now that I've realized that this could be my responsibility, that is to take pressure off mom, given my own individual needs. I built myself a shoe shine box, right? She gave me a couple of bucks. I bought some polish. I made a little piece of material, cotton material, and a brush, and I built this thing, right? You could put your foot on top of it, and I would shine your shoes. So right to the right of our house were the railroad tracks, right? A system of about 8 tracks that, you know, provided, you know, travel between West Coast and East Coast. On the other side of that was the other side of town. And I took that box, not knowing what the deal was, walked across those tracks and went into that area and started shining shoes, right? And I became pretty popular. This little kid, I was like about 9 or 10, right? Just nothing but cowboys, horses, and saloons. I remember hearing my first Western music while I was shining some guy's boots. And I caught into that because it was like, there was something rather tender about that music. You know, there was usually somebody missing somebody or somebody feeling uncomfortable about something, or the party or whatever. And so I carried that with me for a while until I began to grow up. I worked there as a salesman 3 or 4 years after that, and you know.
Yeah. Can I ask you what the going rate was for a shoe shine when you were doing that? And what would you get to maybe get a tip? What would you do?
Boy, I wasn't very much very good at business at the time. I would just expect something, and apparently I did a good job because I'd get 15 to 20 cents, sometimes a quarter, and quite frankly, if I made over a couple of dollars over, let's say, about 3 or 4 hours of work, I would take that money back and give it to my mom. See? And that's what I did. But then I entered a local farmer's market not far from the path of the saloons and bars. And a gentleman took a liking to me. And I ended up working for him at his fruit stand. And he sold tomatoes. His name was Jim Hill. He sold tomatoes. So my job was to, when the trucks would bring in the tomatoes, I would sort the tomatoes out. You know, we cull the tomatoes. You would throw the bad ones out, and you would fashion the packaging, and you'd put them out front, and you would sell them. I ended up being a salesman, et cetera, et cetera. And, but one day, I'm about maybe 10 and a half now. one day I'm in the back facing a truck that had brought in a lot of produce, various assortments of produce now. And suddenly I found myself in the bottom of a barrel. Somebody picked me up and threw me headfirst in a garbage barrel, cussing me. I didn't know what those words were, but I have a scar on my leg now for that. You know, it was the first event of me suffering some effect that said that, why in hell are you here? And Jim stood in the way and told the guy, look, leave him alone. And so the guy walked away, you know, and so I got out of the barrel and dust myself off. And so that was the beginning of life for me, because I'll tell you, even at that early age, I felt that it really, occurred to me that I could hurt somebody if they ever did that to me again.
Was Jim, was that you called him Jim? Was he a white man?
Yes, he was a white man.
Uh-huh.
I was in the white part of town. That's why
see.
I got thrown in the barrel. I wasn't supposed to be there, according to this guy. But now the time had passed, Oklahoma, now that hindsight tells me now that this travesty had happened with the race riots, Oklahoma was a very gentle place. Exterior to my house. I mean, everybody was, no matter where you were, they were cool, loving and caring people, right? And so was Jim. I became very good friends with his son, and I worked there for about 4 or 5 years until I think I was 13 or 14, then I went elsewhere. But I would, lastly, if there were fruits and vegetables that were not so presentable, I would gather those and take them back home to my mother and my family, right? So that's what I did until I discovered my bass.
Okay. Were you anxious to get out of town, so to speak?
Yes. Yes, after that incident, and excuse me, referencing the initial effects of your question, given my neighborhood, there was just something about it that was uncomfortable for me. The kids of my age, I felt that I needed to enjoy growing up in another fashion. I had no idea what it was, but romantically, there was something else out there that would provide comfort as an individual that really by now needed to express himself somehow. I didn't know what that was, but I felt that I needed to be able to speak and express myself, necessary to continue to evolve. So I began thinking of, as a matter of fact, a couple of times I walked down to those old tracks. This was the Santa Fe Railroad. I walked down to the tracks. Thank God, with no trains coming, I was standing in the middle of the tracks and looked down all the way to the end of that, of the conclusion of the track, the 2 tracks, where they meet at a point. And I said, one day I'm going to go that way.
Oh.
Yeah. I did.
That's a marvelous story. I appreciate you sharing it with me. You made a stop in Detroit for a while.
Yeah.
And we made note of jam sessions at Alice McLeod's residence.
Yeah.
This is the future Alice Coltrane. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you describe for us what that was like? What would the tunes be? And was the function of it partly to meet people, to maybe find gigs and just improve yourself?
No, the function of it was mind you, I'm the young guy. I'm just there, you know. I'm out of the exterior, if you will. The function of it was to touch base. The musicians that would gather there each and every Sunday that might be in town or might be at home or something, would just meet and have a good time playing music. That's all it was. It wasn't about having a gig or anything like that. Because as I mentioned before, on the way to New York, now that I'm out of the Army, where I practiced my bass every night until 3 or 4 in the morning for 2 years, you know, why was that? Why was I there at Alice McLeod's house? I could play the instrument, at least to a certain respectable level. So I'm, pretty well employed, opposite that experience. I was playing a lot. So one good thing about it was that I would become friends with Yusuf Lateef, with Elvin Jones, with Paul Chambers, people like that would be there occasionally. And I would also, with open ears, learn from the masters that, provided the world at large with great music out of Detroit.
Did you join the military or were you drafted?
I was drafted.
Okay. I believe they had integrated 7 or 8 years before. I'm sort of guessing on the timeline here, but I wonder what the racial conditions or attitudes were like in the military at that time for you.
Here's what it was. I am now in college. That's another story as to how I got there. I still don't believe how I got there. It was the blessings of God, the gods of the music. But anyway, I had, as a clarinetist, I had entered college on a clarinet scholarship, right? And the moment I entered the school, I was playing with some of the upperclassmen because I seemed to have pretty good mind for the music. But I got caught up in that. And also I met this wonderful lady who was 3 years my senior. I was a freshman, she was a senior. And so I dropped my scholarship as a young kid. Now out of that area where I grew up, man, I was having a good time. But turns out my scholarship would provide, the expenses for the school. So I had to drop out of school for a month, work, and then return with money for the next semester. Then drop out of school for a year, where I ended up in a steel factory, carting, the hot sand from steel and, and all of that. It was, really, that was quite a mess. But I was earning an education. But turns out, after about 3 years of that, I found no employment at all at the end of my junior year. And which was the year that I should have graduated. I was a year behind. So that's when the military, knowing this, they drafted me. Right. So fortunately for me, although I'm now playing the bass, I was still, responsible for clarinet activity in the school orchestra, et cetera, et cetera. And so upon entering the military, I joined the band playing the clarinet, the 158th Army Band out of Fort Knox, Kentucky. this was America's largest tank base. Tanks, 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 forever and ever and ever. And so the wonderful thing about it was that now I had a roof over my head. I got paid every month, saving my money, and I'm practicing. I think I might have mentioned before, I'm practicing throughout the 2 years in the basement. So when I got out of the Army, went back to school and saved my money, went back to school and got my degree, went right to Detroit. See? So that could be an example of how prepared I was, because there was nothing to do in the Army but play your instrument.
That's nice.
Yeah. So when I got to New York, as I mentioned before, I was ready to play. I had no idea at the level that I was, but the fact that I was experiencing a quality of self-worth through my expression.
Yeah.
That was the greatest thing for me. It wasn't about who I was playing with or what it was that I was now exemplifying those moments in my earlier period where I lived, we call it up on the hill, where I needed to, feel something and do something. Now I'm experiencing the reality of that.
Right. You found
excuse me?
You found the end of the railroad track, so to speak.
Yeah, I found a groove.
You found the groove.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah. Speaking of groove, I wanted to talk a little bit more about you. You spoke so eloquently about Paul Chambers and responsibility of notes and the quarter notes. And I'm trying to form a question here that has something to do with the combination of where you put the quarter notes and what pitches you choose to play when.
Excuse me. What pitches I used to play.
What pitches you choose to play on what beats and getting from one chord to the next. I don't really have a question here, Cecil, but
no, I hear you. I do have a question.
Okay.
I'm saying that. I'm actually teaching this quite favorably. I'm actually excited about a couple of students that I'm teaching these techniques to. You asked me before, do I teach them how to play? No, I don't teach. I teach them what to play. I don't teach them what to play. I teach them. I give them information as to be capable, as to provide that they would be capable in any situation. And see, fundamentally, the bass player soloing, that is the reward of the effort, of previous efforts. That is to understand that your function, you're the timekeeper, right? The pronouncement of that quarter note, given 1, 2, 3, 4, the pronouncement of that quarter note is very essential. That not only that it's pronounced exactly on the beat, but that it expands when it's played, only to blend in with the next tone on the second or third beat, right? So that keeps the time and even directs the functions of various harmonies that would prevail at the time. Main thing is that you would, as a young kid coming along, this is your fundamental reality, that you're the timekeeper, and accented by your choices of qualities of tones. Now, qualities of tones reference, of course, the current scale or the current chord, given your choices of tones as you proceed from situation to situation. I mean, really, if you know what you're doing and you understand what the science of that is, that provides uniquely, for the most part, individuality. Because as you choose that tone, you are the one that made that decision at that time for that purpose, given how you feel about the moment. Now, if you want to, like I did earlier, every now and then infuse something that Paul did, then that's all good as a learning spirit. But as you grow and mature, then the individuality should prevail, because you know more what you're doing, to the extent that you can make unique individual choices. Because see, this music that we are excited about in this world is about improvisation, of course. Improvisation is about adding something to a given situation, removing something from a given situation, or letting it stand entirely. See? And sometimes that can be in motion, or when you're standing still. You can lay the bar lines down and fashion various progressions that way. So how you, the choices that you make in terms of, reducing something or adding something, as, things are progressing, that provides individuality, given the extent of your study, and which would, which you would provide awareness of really what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So this is what I'm teaching these guys. It's not about, you've got a tune. It's not what you should play. It's, the excitement of choices that you make at the moment as you go from situation to situation. I teach that playing is about a series of crescendos from left to right. It's about arriving and departing from the situation. As you arrive to a situation, you're actually leaving a situation simultaneously. There is where the uniqueness of individuality is. The choice that you make at that moment, leaving and departing and arriving and departing. So
those are some very quotable statements, Cecil.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, indeed. I will paraphrase them from my saxophone students. I think really beautiful. And I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention last time, that I now have two favorite tones from bassists, and you are one, and Buster Williams is the other.
Buster Williams? Oh yeah, Buster is an amazing bass player. His tonality, he's the exactness, if you will, of what I just talked about. His choices of tones, pronouncement of the tones as they blend in with other tones. He's really somebody that I highly respect.
Yeah, excellent. So when you got to New York, we talked about, you felt pretty good about your musicianship, and it sounds to me like you had less of a struggle than a lot of other musicians. I don't know if you can compare your experience to someone else, but you played from 69 to 72, if my facts are correct, both with Alice Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders simultaneously?
Mostly with Pharoah.
Okay.
Occasionally, I was in Pharoah's band at the time.
Yes.
Occasionally, I play a concert with Alice.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe first a recording session with Pharoah Sanders? What did you know beforehand, if anything, when you went to the session? Had you played the music live?
Yeah, we occasionally the music was played live. Previously, which would upgrade or prepare you for the recording. Sometimes when you enter the studio unfamiliar with any kind of performance of that particular selection, you might have to really focus on the responsibilities that I just explained. But Pharoah was one who I met Pharoah when I was playing a couple of gigs with Alice Coltrane, and it was like somehow, I forget, but somehow I had heard Pharoah's record called Karma, right? And I heard it on the radio, so I bought a copy of it, so the vinyl records. And I couldn't take it off for months because I loved it. It was a vamp that just maintained and maintained. And see, that's what Pharoah was about. You know, you establish a tonal center from which many things can spring, given various collectives of individuality. But I couldn't get past the bass player on that record, who was Richard Davis, who is to this day my greatest idol, along with Paul Chambers. Richard Davis, the sound of his tone and its quality of tonal pronouncement, which is where I, how do you say, found my initial techniques for teaching, you know, that the placement of the quarto was through that record, Karma. The way he played his notes just blew me away. And that's kind of how I play now, blended in with some techniques of Paul Chambers. And also Richard was one who was in other areas of improvisation, was one who would pour over the glass, or pour over the border of the instrument. He was always one that was like playing other things past what responsibility was. And I liked that because that gave me reason to express who I really was. That is, someone that wanted to become more expressive out there in the area that I wasn't familiar with.
I see.
And the way to do that was to put all those techniques I spoke about before and just go out there and play that, referencing where you came from.
Uh-huh.
And see, so that's how I ended up in Pharoah's band, because that's what we did. Maybe on a B-flat 7, we would band forever, and we, you know, everybody would be free to play back and forth across the line, harmonically or whatever.
Right. I just was listening to some of that kind of thing, and there was a tune, Prince of Peace.
Yeah.
And the overall quality of it is fairly peaceful, but at around 10 minutes,
What you gonna say?
you're talking about
Wow.
things that can spring out of people, and it shocked me, and it's honestly it's rather frightening until, and it's just I'm wondering if you remember that specifically, and do you believe that Pharoah expected the accompanists to go with him?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now that you have provided assurance that what is taking place currently is secure in terms of its intent to express, it's all right to go over there now, because you placed that premise, that you've provided that premise from which it comes. See? So in performance, it's okay to go out there because you've done so well, which causes for you to feel that it's okay to go out there, that, in leaving where you were, the memory of that prevails. So you can just do what you want, and play collectively. Everybody's listening and adhering to the rules of tonal placement, of harmonic placement, rhythmic, let's say participation, what's the word?
Interaction.
Interaction, yeah. And see, you're out there and you're doing your thing only to return to where you came from, or either just let it go. For instance, speaking of Pharoah, the current bass that I have now, which I've had since then. This is 1969. My principal bass. I have one other. I had gone into a store on 42nd Street between 6th and 7th Avenues in New York, where it was a bass shop, to get some strings. And there were 3 basses on a rack. And the first bass really appealed to me. It had the shape and curves that just audible past what I had experienced before. It was like an upgrade. So I played it and fell in love with it, and ended up buying it, right? And so that was 2 weeks before we recorded Thimby. So in the studio, we were going to play this tune, and Pharoah, being somewhat unpredictable at times in terms of what he would play, when he would play, and how he would play, you had to go with that. He said, hey, look, let McBee play something out front, and then we'll come in at letter A at my cue, right? So I just started playing. And this was a tune called Love, that to this day, in my travels around the world, people were very, very appreciative of my quality of expression, my quality of thought. And I mean, that was like, although I had played with other people before that, it is said that that's when the world acknowledged that there's a new bass player in town, Cecil McBee.
All right.
I just opened up and played. I went to my living room in my head, and I went to my living room and just started playing all my stuff that I practiced, right? And then when I finished, we went into the tune. So that was the thing to do with Pharoah. Either you begin outside of the music and you entered some, structure, then you left it. And so I was with him for about 3 years, and it was just a wonderful experience.
Was there ever any question how these tunes were going to end? How do you get to the end?
Of course, some tunes were like, of course, by the way, now that the melody is played, we'll retard here and we'll end there. Of course, we would do that. We would discuss,
Yes.
But a lot of the times they would, finding an ending was rather difficult. So the tune would continue until you find something you could tell out there. But that was all fun, because as I said before, what had prevailed, the volume of music that you had played that was wonderful, given, the excitement of the audience, upon ending, you couldn't do anything wrong.
I think I know the answer to this, but can I guess that the practice of overdubbing was not employed on these recordings?
Not with Vera, no.
Okay.
Yeah, we did that with later on when I was with
Who's that?
Jackie McLean, my first.
Oh, yes.
We did that, when things were more or less, in line structurally, et cetera, et cetera. You would open up, that's where they had those tapes and, those big thick tapes and.
Right.
Yeah. But with Pharoah, I don't recall ever doing that with anything. The themes were like from A all the way to Z and pass with fury, either be it in the quietest of the night or the loudest of the center of the city.
Did you ever read reviews on some of these recordings or live gigs with Pharoah where the reviewer called the music angry?
Never heard of that.
Okay, I'm sort of glad because,
Really?
well, I think sometimes people associate free jazz, especially during the civil rights movement, as if it had to have is this expressing anger or and
Oh, well, you got to remember, sorry to interrupt,
please.
but that exterior out there, those who profess that they know what they're talking about in terms of what the intent of the music is, should kind of like move back a little bit, because if you're gonna consider what we were doing, you're lost, buddy, or whoever you are, because Pharoah's music was all about peace and happiness. That's what Karma was about. Da 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 da. Peace and happiness for everyone. And you play that band forever. That's what
Yes.
it's about. Even with when the music would go off the structure, that was like somebody getting happy with the spirit in church.
Oh, that explains it for me.
Yes.
Thank
I
you.
can
Yeah.
remember. I can remember when I was it was about a year and a half before I began shining shoes. I ended up living with my paternal grandmother. And the moment I entered her home, she had a Bible right here. She set me down on the bed and began, reading to me the various passages. I had no idea what was going on. My feet weren't even touching the floor. But she was like, she called me Season, sit down. And Jesus said, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, And if I listened well, I got a piece of that pound cake out of the cabinet, right? But her church was right next door. You could walk through her side. There was a door on the side of her house, cross a little walkway, and into a church. Right, and I remember sitting there. My legs are still not. My feet are still not touching the floor. She's to my right, right, and the preacher was preaching to a point of excitement that I got a little afraid. I just, it's my first time hearing something at that intensity. And then suddenly my grandmother got the spirit. And she's on the floor now, and these ladies are fanning her, and the church is still having, this celebration of life. And so I said, she was out, so I thought it would be a good idea to get up and go back through the walkway back into the house. And the moment I put my foot on the floor, she grabbed me like that. Her left hand helped me, right? And man, I'll tell you, when she grabbed me, she was with the spirit. I felt something, right? And so that experience is what gave me some reason to believe, to understand the more in-depth performances with Pharoah, because it was all about that kind of vibe. It's about the celebration of love and peace and positivity. So, and I was with her for 3 years, and it was absolutely wonderful.
The second line to the melody you were singing goes, peace and happiness. The Creator
As a master
makes but one demand, peace and happiness through all the land.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you feel in this day and age that that's possible.
Of course. Of course. It's from whence it comes. We're at an extreme deviation from that reality. Reality is love, and love is truth. That's the is what it causes the manifestation of all things. That's our nucleus. That's our soul. It's always there. It's a matter of how far you get away from it, which can lead you the wrong way. And I think the world at large now, at least this world of ours, is suffering a major distraction from that premise, from the soul of what America has always been about. I mentioned before about in Oklahoma, the love that I got from the community, and America, hey, I mean, we're diverse, but one of the greater things that we're very, very conscious of and proud of is that there's a great intense amount of love here in various forms and shapes that has been distracted.
Oh, thanks
Yeah.
for sharing that.
America, this is a wonderful place, man. Look at what we have here. Everything that you can possibly imagine creatively and possibilities, are here. I think given other nations that have suffered through passages or situations socially, economically, or whatever, for instance, look at China. They suffered Japan's situation. Look at the Greece, the Italian. America is now right in the center of a passage. It's growing up. This situation is causing us to be aware of not only who we all are, but ourselves individually. It's a natural unfoldment of things. Every country goes through it. This is a very natural thing. This man came along and said, hey, you now have to become aware of who you are and what your intent is through the respect or acknowledgement of that person 6 feet away from you. What is all that about? This young country, America, is growing up. It's out of its teenage years. It's just a natural unfoldment. It all depends on how we handle it.
So on your website, I'm going to suggest that you add to your bassist, composer, and educator, also philosopher, Cecil.
Oh no! I just speak what I think it is.
Okay.
I'm just,
Well, it was a compliment. So, so over my shoulders, I have a picture of a few of my musical heroes, including Cannonball Adderley, Lester Young, Count Basie, and I know you worked with Dinah Washington. So the music of these people may be looked at as less spiritual than the music you played with Pharoah Sanders. So I'm wondering how you think of that music in society. What is the role of that music in society?
I don't think it's any less spiritual. I think it's just a different approach. Remember, I mentioned earlier that it's about adding something, taking something away, how you manage those conditions as they flow to and forth. Conceptually, these individuals are doing their thing accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
More or less effort, more or less intent to express maybe not a spiritual situation, but a statement that references the moment of who they are individually and collectively. As I professed, if you will, initially, earlier, it can't be done the same way. I mentioned again that your unique approach to that particular moment is what makes your intent unique and the result unique. So their uniqueness, uh, are very inspirational to cause for me or us to not only want to more or less appreciate that, but to find your own individuality so that you can perhaps make a statement as large as they did in your own way.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, as a clarinetist in junior high school, my initial phases of my prowess on the clarinet, given my junior high school band, we were all required to sit in the early evening, about 7 o'clock. This is in Tulsa, in the football stadium. Every student had to be there. Why? We had no idea, right? But in the center of the field, at the 50-yard line, was a piano, a bass, and a set of drums. Right? So us being kids, middle school, what the hell is this? Let's get through this thing and go home, right? Turns out it was Lester Young.
Oh.
They were, God bless them. When I heard that music, when I first heard it, it was like there was something about it that touched me in according to how I felt about things. I mean, there was something about it that, made me want to feel good and maybe, realize something else. How great they were this was total, African-American neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I can never forget that. That was, I think, really the beginning of me wanting to play music down the line once I heard music that was similar to that. That's running wild.
That's an amazing story. I've had similar experiences but it was on recordings, and you're so touched by something that you're compelled to go find out more about that.
Yeah. What was it? How did I get into that?
Well, I had talked about Cannonball and Lester Young, and you were saying that their music was spiritual, just in a different way.
Well, if it ain't spiritual, don't play it. If it's not, your spirit is what makes you, play the instrument.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it means if you're not spiritual, you ain't feeling nothing. So like Elvin Jones used to say, if you ain't playing nothing, get him off the stage. Let somebody else get up there and play it. So the various perceptions and concepts that all of these great musicians have brought to our ears are highly respected. It's just that everybody's doing it their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, me, since this thing is about me, what was it? I at the conclusion of a band rehearsal at my high school, my junior year, I had put my clarinet into the little box and was now reaching across something on the floor that that kind of prevented access to the compartment where I would store my clarinet. And I looked down and there was a bass. I said, oh, huh. So I put the clarinet in, I picked the bass up and played a note. And I said, right away it was like, whoa, that sounds wonderful. Right? So I tried to play the thing. It was the bass was like made of metal.
Oh, an aluminum bass, yes.
Aluminum bass.
Yes.
So I tried to play something, and it, tried to play some boogie woogie on it, like I had heard on the jukebox, and and so a couple of days later, I got some buddies, to join me, and we would try to play some boogie woogie or something, you know. There was a trombone player, saxophone player, and there was a drummer, no piano player. So we had a good time. And then a couple of months later, we're in the same room, somebody knocked on the door. And Wesley, my buddy, alto player, who was a star forward for the basketball team, he opened the door, and there was this guy in all of this color, and he's about the size, the height of Miles Davis, right? Had his hair slicked back, and it had a gold tooth here, right? And he says, "Hey, man," he says, "I'm looking for Cecil McBee." Which one of you is Cecil McBee? Because we were sitting down, resting, and I raised my hand, and my buddy told me, "Hey, man, that's Jimmy Cry Cry Hawkins, man." I said, "Jimmy Cry Cry?" And Jimmy Cry Cry said, "Cecil McBee here?" I said, "Yeah, I'm Cecil McBee." He says, "Hey, man, I hear you play the bass pretty good, man. You play it pretty good. Say, I got a band. You want to play with my band?" And my buddy said, "Oh, man, he knows Cecil McBee?" And so I ended up going with Jimmy Cry Cry to Wichita, Kansas on my first gig, sitting in the rear of this car in early October. The window was out. There was a towel to prevent the wind from coming in. Played my first gig where Jimmy Cry Cry would stand on his head. This was before James Brown. He would stand on his head, literally crying, while he would hold the mic. He would support his body with his right hand and hold the mic literally upside down, crying because his baby left it. That was my first gig.
I love it. I love it.
And still, to this day, Jimmy Cry Cry is a great part of Tulsa's history.
I see. So, what would your grandmother have thought if you played a boogie woogie record in her house?
My God, I hear her today. She told me, she said, "Don't ever go to those reels." She called them reels, REELS, which meant the movies. At the time, there was like, what's that? All of the, Fats Navarro, people like that, right? And apparently, at the time in Tulsa, jazz music and rock and rhythm and blues were just, really the substance of entertainment for the entire community. And I think she had an encounter with one of the people in the family that hung out at the clubs, contrary to going to her church. She told me, "Don't you ever go to those reels or go to those places where they drink that alcohol and smoke those dirty cigarettes." I was like that. That's why when she got happy, I wanted to get up out of there and run. And I think about that often, because if she knew that I was playing this kind of music, she would be very uncomfortable with me.
I see. Yeah, this would have been late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, this was like, let me see, I was, early 40s when I was with her. I was with her when I was
okay. That's right, because
7, 8. And the early 50s was 52 was when I discovered the bass.
I see. 1952. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, but it was. Well, the point is, I didn't make was that the moment I touched that bass, the first moment I touched that bass, I was the new bass player in town because there were no bass players there. So, I was tolerated until I could find my way.
Well, I don't know if you can remember, but you went to this gig with Jimmy Cry Cry. Is that right?
Yeah.
And did someone say, uh, "Okay, blues in A," or
Oh,
did you just?
no, you just started playing and you heard it. And usually the blues were at B flat,
Yes.
like
Okay.
B flat seven, like a boogie woogie kind of sound.
I love it that years later you're playing B flat seven with Pharoah Sanders.
Well, it wasn't too long before after this episode with Jimmy Cry Cry that what's his name jumped off the tongue. I ended up in a in the jazz club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, uh, which was called Clarence Love's Lounge. Clarence Love was one of the big band leaders throughout the 20s and early 30s that traveled throughout the Southwest, along with another local big band headed by uh, 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 jumping off my head now, but it'll come back to me. But he apparently had reasonable. Well, Tulsa is not too far north of Houston, not too far south of Kansas City, right? 92 miles east of Oklahoma City. It was right in the heart of Route 66.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of musical activity, in that area. So Clarence and Ernie Fields, the other band leader, was uh, they were fashionable throughout the whole Southwest, from Kansas City to Dallas to New Mexico and so when I entered the scene, I entered right in the heart of all of that.
Nice.
And found myself in Clarence Love's Lounge, where I knew nothing about chord changes, nothing. But they put me on the stage and said, count off, so we playing this tune, and I had to listen to it and play because I was the only bass player around. So apparently I had a decent ear because, after the year, that is the complete year of my junior year in high school, I knew all my standard tunes. It was just, which meant that not only that I have a fairly decent ear with Jimmy Cry Cry, but I had a pretty good placement of that tone, being, off Boogie Woogie when I entered Clarence Love's place, which says that I had a respectful feeling in the placement of my quarter-notes, which would keep the rhythm and the feeling while they played whatever it was, regardless of the notes that I played. That feeling was prevalent. Remember that I told you about that?
Indeed. Yeah.
And by the time I entered college the next year, I knew all my standard tunes.
Well, the percussive qualities of the stand-up bass, I think, are so important beyond the incorrect notes you might play. If you were providing that rhythm for the dancers and so forth, that would have enough to keep you on the bandstand.
But they were dancers also. We won't go into that.
Why not?
Well, that way I grew up quite rapidly as a young man.
I see.
With belly dancers and shake dancers, and
Yes.
I became quite aware of some things that I would eventually find some reason to, feel good about.
Okay. Enough said.
Yeah.
I want to talk. We're getting time to wrap up here, and I so enjoy our conversations. I wanted to ask you about song titles and how they relate to the sound of the music and the intent of the music. We talked a little bit. We mentioned some of Pharoah Sanders' pieces and Alice Coltrane. Now, when your own compositions, do you have titles in mind before you start, or does something sort of come to you as the song progresses?
Good question. Excuse me. I might have mentioned before that currently, given this COVID situation, I've been working on 4 compositions. Some tunes, one tune I'll work on today, to find limits, then I might go to another one tomorrow. I'm almost completed. But what I do is, since the very beginning, that is my first composition in New York was a tune called Song of Her. We mentioned that before. That's on the second side of the Forest Flower album, recorded by Charles Lloyd. That was a moment where I felt sort of sublime. I felt sort of alone. I felt lonely. I felt that I needed some comfort to better express myself in more positive, and more positive moments of expression, et cetera, et cetera. When that feeling occurs, I, quite frankly, even at that particular time, I would sit at the piano and I would play something that might, give me reason to feel more relaxed or more acceptable to a nice sound, and then if that sound pleases me, I will try to respond to it with a subsequent sound, and so forth and so forth and so on. And I've learned that rather than try to compare that moment with what had prevailed, the uniqueness of it would be that, write it down at the moment, situation. And then later on, once you're complete, now I went through this just yesterday, the piano room is over there. I'm working on something that's really, really very nice. It's like, once it's complete, then I will write the melody. In other words, the chord changes, the rhythms and everything like that, that comes first. Then the melody comes secondary, and that's like a painting, you add this note, that note, and that note, now on paper, and that corresponds to the feeling of that particular chord, and so forth. And then if that's successful, then you might find reason to adventure it into another area, maybe 4 parts at a time. But then the next day, you might want to return. Now, upon returning to some creative moment, then you might want to make adjustments to those tones. Now that you add a new moment, a new vibe, you might want to flat that tone or raise that tone or leave that tone alone. And in response to not only what had prevailed, but it might advance notice crossing the borderline into another situation. So you might want to make changes as you go along. Instead of using a ninth or a fifth, I might use a sixth that might go down to a 2, and then, et cetera, et cetera. So once the tune is completed, then it's time to name the tune. I've got a list of names that come to me occasionally that I've written back there in my studio, but none have found worth to these 3 tunes.
I
So
see.
I'm just waiting,
Yeah. I wanted to say I enjoyed that tune that's on your website called Ladybug.
Oh, you like that?
I do like that.
Well, the one that I'm working on now that has me excited is Ladybug number 2. Right. Yeah, it's the same structure, but the melodies are just absolutely amazing.
All right.
Ladybug originated from a jam session that we had at a neighbor's house in Maine, in Yarmouth, Maine. I would, some wonderful neighbors. We were having a party, and I sat at the piano, and my recently married Rita, who you just met recently,
Yes.
she would sing, something. So I just, tried something in D minor, and that's how that tune sprang, and how it came alive.
Right. Well,
and she wrote the words to it.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
Just to wrap up, an acquaintance knew I was going to be talking to you, and he said, "Oh, he's played with everyone." I'm curious if he ever recorded with Miles Davis.
No, I didn't record with Miles Davis, but I had an episode with Miles Davis. Herbie Hancock called me. Well, what's that? My first recording we discussed before was Some of the Stuff with Grayson Munker, featuring Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Tony Williams. This is how I met Herbie and those guys. And so apparently I was rather impressive with my dynamic. Well, Herbie called me and says, Miles would like you to do a performance with him. So I said, yeah, okay. And by now, I mean, that was like a couple of years later. By now, I'm playing literally around the world with Keith Jarrett, Jack DeSonet, and Charles Lloyd, and we're having a great time. That was just my joy. So Miles Davis, that was going to be just a gig, in Buffalo, New York. So, quite frankly, I had no idea of the immensity of that, because I just wanted to play what we were playing. I mean, playing with Jack was just, and Keith were just, all I was about. But we, on 77th Street, on the third floor of Miles's brownstone, we had gone through all the tunes. Music was like that, right? No Miles Davis, right? So at the conclusion of the rehearsal, the last tune in the key of C, there was Herbie and Wayne were at the piano discussing the voicing of a G something chord, G7 chord. And they couldn't find it. All of a sudden, burst through the door was Miles Davis. And he went over to the piano and he said, you play it like this. His fingers like, little skinny fingers are like little matchsticks. I mean, little pencils. And he put his fingers on the piano very carefully, and the sound was just wonderful. And I said to myself, so that he's the guy that teaches all these guys what he, needs harmonically and conceptually, and so didn't say anything to me and walked right out. Didn't even look at me, walked right out. So my first thought was, this guy has been standing outside listening to me, right? So I said, oh, okay. Well, apparently I did something right, because I found myself on the gig the next week in Buffalo, New York. And the moment I hit the stage, Miles put me through the heat, man. He just man, he did everything opposite we rehearsed, called all the tunes that we didn't rehearse. At all the fast tempos, So it was like, I felt like I was like against the wall. Wah, 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 wah. I said, please.
Well, he was a boxer, wasn't he?
Well, I wanted to hit him, but he might knock me out. So I said,
okay.
Well.
Mr.
That's what happened.
Yeah. All right.
It was fun. It was a good experience.
Yeah. Well, let me wrap up with effusive thanks for your stories and your wisdom. And I wonder if you've had so many high points. Have you had any regrets in your life, or does that kind of thinking just not work for you?
Well, you asked me in the previous uh, talk uh, whether or not I had had bumps or periods that prevailed on my arrival in New York. Uh, Financially, I never really suffered any doubt of that, but I did uh, enter a period of 9 years. This was right after Pharoah Sanders that I was off the stage for 9 years. There were some social considerations that were beyond my control, and I could not, find a stage for 9 years.
Hmm.
This was like from maybe 74 through what's that, 80, 83, 84, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was off the stage for that period of time. And given the development of my music personally, although I stayed in the woodshed most of the time, I think that impacted who I was, that I had to fast recover from in order to get myself back on track. Something that happened that I mentioned with what we're going through as a nation now. Life entered and caused me to stop. I was moving really fast and very successfully in New York, so I had to stop and make an adjustment as to who I was and what the step was. It was a natural phenomenon that caused me to just go to the mirror and look and discover who you really are, Cecil McBee. Because from the moment I played with Jimmy Crock right all the way through New York, it was fast track. I had never taken consideration of any measurable distractions. So that's what I entered. So I had to work through some personal considerations that were, I should say now, rather worthy of my time, because I became a better person, better musician, and a better man.
And we're better for it. So thank you very much. This has just been 2+ hours of fascinating dialogue back and forth, and it makes a unique contribution to our oral history collection. And I hope you have many, many, many more mornings where you meet your bass.
Yeah, I hope so too. Every now and then it tells me to get the hell out of here. I don't have to do that. But everything is, really, very exciting for me now. I'm hoping to get my book out there. My bass book that I mentioned to you. I've
Yes,
written that. I've documented the techniques of the bass.
excellent.
Ready for schools, if you will, around the world. And hopefully I can find a publisher which might assist me in getting the book out there, given today's technology.
Yes.
It's right there. I've been it for about 25, 30 years.
Well, thanks again, and best of luck to you.
I appreciate, and the feeling is mutual.
All right.
Thank you.